it's on. Oh. Is it working? It's working. Okay, thank you for coming to our second of the Victor Obenhaus lectures this year. Today we have Sunhee June speaking, and we have a nice introduction from Dr. Yang.
Hi, everyone. Reverend Sunhee Jun has an undergraduate degree in psychology in Korea and has 3 master's degrees. Yes, I said 3 masters. He earned an MDiv and a THM before coming to the United States. He received an award for excellence for his THM thesis. His 3rd master's degree CTS. It's a little bit different. Thank you. Thank you. Ordained by the Presbyterian Church of Korea in 2010, he has served as a pastor for 7 years. Since 2007, he has actively participated in social justice movements. In 2009, he founded Fair Trade Christian Association, which is a social justice movement group, and led it for 3 years. Currently, he is serving as youth group ministry director in a Korean American church in the Chicago suburbs. In recent years, he TA'd 2 of my Gospels courses, and in both of them, he was an extremely popular TA loved by students. Currently, he is in the 5th year of his PhD program, studying sacred texts and hermeneutical strategies. His interests include postcolonialism and feminism as hermeneutical lenses to read biblical texts. He has already written 2 papers and presented each of them at the annual SBL. And at 2016 SBL meeting, he presented his first paper, Voices from the Othered, reading Mark chapter 16, from a Korean perspective in the Asian and Asian American hermeneutics section. And the second paper, When Ghost Becomes Demon, in the contextual biblical interpretation section in 2017. A few days ago, his 3rd paper, titled Beyond Boundaries, Reading Asenath from a Postcolonial Perspective, has been accepted by Sudepigrapha section to present at this year's SBL meeting. Today, he is going to talk about what you see here, right? Please welcome Reverend Sunhee Jun. Thank you.
Good evening. As you can see, today's lecture is a feminist reading of the Markan ending. And I identify myself as a feminist. If any of you think that I'm not eligible to be a feminist because I'm a male, obviously, I would like to say this. At least my name is very feminine. Actually, my name, Sunhee, is woman's name in Korea. Probably Koreans know about that. I'm going to share one episode about my name. When I was 14 years old, I had an appendectomy, And my father brought me to a hospital at 3 or 4 a.m. And a staff member of the hospital assigned me to a female patient's room, just by my name. And another staff member brought me to the room, and they realized that I was a boy. So I said, that's okay. I'm completely comfortable here, so please let me be here. But they kicked me out. Many people asked me why your parents gave you such a female name. And actually, I didn't know why. But while preparing this lecture, recently, I realized that maybe my parents are prophets. They knew that someday this name would be helpful to me. Or maybe they wanted me to resist kind of essentialist categorization of feminism. So I'm proud of my name and my parents. This lecture deals with the silence of the three women at the tomb: Mary Magdalene, and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome, in the ending of the Gospel of Mark. But prior to entering this topic, I feel like I need to explain a bit about the Markan ending for those who are not familiar with it. The majority of biblical scholars think that the Gospel of Mark ends with chapter 16, or verse 8, not with verse 20, which appears in the current Bibles like this. The problem is that 16:8 doesn't seem to be suitable as an ending of this gospel, because it says they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. The Gospel of Mark begins with good news, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Even though Jesus is crucified, a young man at the tomb declares the resurrection of Jesus and commands the three women to deliver the news to people. So, if we accept the verse 8 is the original ending of Mark, this gospel suddenly ends with silence, while the news of the risen Jesus is not delivered. For this reason, there were some attempts to add stories to the original ending by people who are not satisfied with the Markan ending, with the women's silence. And Mark 16:9-20, that is called the long ending, is one of them. And you can find another version called the short ending in the Bibles like this. And all that had been commanded them, they told briefly to those around Peter. And afterward, Jesus himself sent out through them, from east to west, the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. Recently, many biblical scholars believe that this sudden ending was intentional. So they focus on understanding what Mark's intention was, or on finding meanings of this ending. Specifically, many Markan scholars have struggled to interpret the silence of the women in the Markan ending. The main problem in the interpretation of the silence is, why do the women at the tomb flee without saying anything to anyone? Many possible interpretations have been suggested. Although they are all different in detail, traditionally two interpretative approaches have been prevail among them. First, some interpreters understand the women's silence as their failure in discipleship. For example, Francis Moloney says, quote, Mark indicates that in the end, the women who have followed Jesus through the experience of the cross to the grave finally join the other disciples in the fear and flight of their failure, end quote. Secondly, Other scholars read the women's silence as a religious response to their encounter with divinity. Here, the silence is understood to be a proper response before the divine presence. Richard Bauckham sees the woman's response with reference to Peter's response to Jesus' transfiguration. According to Bauckham, Peter should have stayed silent before the mysterious event, but instead, he speaks impetuously. Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, something like this. For the women, Bauckham says, quote, what has happened is mystery beyond their comprehension, and they rightly do not attempt to explain it to others, end quote. It seems that feminist approaches to the silence of the women do not digress far from these 2 categories, but their emphasis is slightly different. On the one hand, some feminist biblical scholars agree with the view that the silence of the women shows their failure in discipleship. But they emphasize that all disciples in Mark, male or female, equally failed. Male disciples betray and flee before Jesus' crucifixion, and although female disciples stay with Jesus to the last, finally, they join in the followers of Jesus. Well, some of them argued that the women's failure cannot be considered equally with the male disciples. For example, Victoria Phillips says, quote, failing to deliver a message is not comparable to deserting one's teacher after promising one's loyalty, as did the 12, when Jesus informed them they would abandon him, end quote. On the other hand, some feminists try to interpret the women's silence very positively. It seems that they want to maintain their positive view on the Markan women to this last scene. Beyond the natural response to the divinity, some of them highlight the value of the silence itself. For example, Sunhee Kim argues that silence is not negative from Buddhist and Taoist perspective. In her interpretation, the women's silence is a voluntary practice to follow Jesus' kenosis, that is self-emptying. Although these 2 approaches, silence as failure and silence as a religious response, seem to very different or opposite, both approaches share one assumption in common. That is, the silence is the subjective decision of the women. Therefore, the responsibility for the silence as their decision is given to the women. For this reason, in the first approaches, interpreters see the woman's silence negatively because they do not speak to people about the risen Jesus, even though they are commanded to do so. The interpreters in the second approaches see the women's silence positively because their silence before divinity is a proper, decisive response as human beings to show their deep awe and reverence in that moment. However, it seems that such interpretations fail to see the way in which the Markan women characters are created in the Markan narrative as a whole. In other words, they do not consider the narrative structure surrounding the Markan women, which is already colored by the androcentric lens of Mark. As a result, without consideration of the way in which Mark constructs the women characters, the first view accuses the women of not speaking, and the later view risks valorizing the women's silence. In this lecture, I argued that the women's silence can be read as the deprived voices of the women. At the same time, it symbolically shows the position of the Markan women in general, whose voices are not permitted publicly in the Markan narrative. To prove this lecture will proceed in two steps. First, to understand women's silence in a new way, I will draw Gayatri Spivak's critical view of representation, which was raised in her article, Can the Subaltern Speak? And secondly, I will examine all stories of Mark where women appear in terms of their speech. The analysis of women's speech through Spivak's idea will help to see how the Markan women are silenced by the representation of male characters or the narrator. In the article, Can the Subaltern Speak?, Spivak provocatively argues that the subaltern cannot speak. The term subaltern was coined by Antonio Gramsci to designate non-elite or subordinated social groups by hegemonies of power. This term was adopted by Guha to refer to any sort of subordinated groups, quote, whether this is expressed in terms of class, caste, age, gender, and office, or in any other way, end quote. According to Spivak, the reason why the subaltern cannot speak is not because they don't have any voices, but because their voices are delivered while being distorted by the representational system. In other words, what we hear is not the voices of the subaltern, but their represented voices. Here the problem of representation arises. In fact, representation has been a target of criticism in post-colonial studies. For example, in the book Orientalism, Edward Said criticized the Western representation of the East by revealing its complicity with the imperial desire to control the East. On the other hand, Spivak's target is towards radical intellectuals who try to recuperate the marginalized voices rather than the imperialist. It is because, from Spivak's view, even the radical intellectuals are complicit in silencing the subordinated people by appropriating them in the system of representation. To understand this problem of representation, we need to examine the gap of the dual meaning in representation. According to Spivak, representation has two meanings. One is representation as speaking for, as in politics. The other is representation as representation, seen in art or philosophy. These two meanings are closely connected, but Spivak argues that they cannot be conflated as some intellectuals do. According to Spivak, when intellectuals try to retrieve a marginalized people's voices, this representation in artistic sense brings them to the position of a representative in political sense. Then the voices of the subaltern are delivered by the intellectuals as the representative of the subaltern. Here, the intellectual's representation acts as if it transparently shows or delivers the subaltern's voices. In other words, setting themselves up as a representative, the intellectual acts as if their representation can be identical with voices of the subaltern, concealing their position as a representative. However, intellectuals represent the subaltern's voices just in their position based on their own interest. Therefore, Spivak argues that the intellectual should recognize that they are not showing the subaltern just like a camera lens transparently, but they are speaking about the subaltern's voices inevitably in their position. Let me show examples. Guha and the Subaltern Studies group point out that the historiography of Indian nationalism has been long dominated by elitism. Whether it is colonialist or bourgeoisie nationalist. So they try to rethink Indian colonial historiography from the perspective of the subaltern. In this trial of representation, they act like a representative of the subaltern. And here, as a representative of the subaltern, their writing of the Indian history, which is a representation, is equated with the subaltern's consciousness. But it is just their representation written in their position as intellectuals. While Gruha and the Subaltern Studies Group tried to recuperate the subaltern's voices, Foucault and Deleuze seems to retreat from intellectuals' representation. Foucault says, quote, "The masses know perfectly well, clearly. They know far better than intellectuals, and they certainly say it very well," end quote. Deleuze claims, quote, "Reality is what actually happens in factory, in a school, in barracks, in prison, in a police station," end quote. Likewise, they argue that the subaltern knows and can speak for themselves, and therefore, intellectuals do not represent, but pass on or deliver their concrete experience transparently. Although it seems that they try to establish subjectivity of the subaltern, Spivak criticized them because by doing that, they re-establish themselves as sovereign subject, though hidden, because the concrete experience of the subaltern is actually the experience of the intellectual who observed them. Through widow sacrifice sati, Spivak shows how the subaltern are silenced by the attempts of representation by intellectuals. According to her, around sati are two hegemonic discourses to capture the women's consciousness. The first is the discourse of the British imperialists expressed as white men saving brown women from brown men. Here, under the name of establishing a good society, which means the Western society, the women of sati are represented as an object to be saved by white men, the imperialist. Against this, secondly, the nativist argues the women wanted to die. Likewise, the nativists romanticize the women's purity and strength, praising them as a free subject of their decision. Both the imperialists and the nativists consider themselves as representative of the women. Neither present the women's voices. They are just using the women to justify their ideology. On the one hand, imperialism, on the other hand, nationalist patriarchal system. Enclosed by these hegemonic discourses, the voices of the women are muted. With the help of Spivak's critique of representation, I will examine all stories that include the Markan women in terms of their speech. This investigation will show that the silence of the women in the Markan ending is not their subjective decision, but the forced silence by the Markan epistemic violence. I categorized the speech of the Markan women in three types. The first type of woman in Mark is the one who appears in a story but does not have any voices by the ending of the story. By voice, I mean the direct speech. In Mark chapter 1, 29 to 31, Jesus and some of his disciples entered the house of Simon and Andrew. Jesus healed Simon's mother-in-law, who was in bed with fever. Then the woman began to serve them. Simon's mother-in-law appears in this scene, but after recovery, she serves Jesus and the male disciples without any voice. This woman serving has been considered as a positive model of discipleship by many feminists in terms of the word diakoneo, which is also used in angel serving in Mark 1:13 and in Jesus' teaching of discipleship in chapter 10. However, when it is viewed from overall observation about the situation of the women in Mark in terms of speech, this silence will be understandable. Jesus' mother and his sister visit Jesus in Mark chapter 3. They don't speak anything. The crowd speaks. Your mother and your brothers and sisters are outside asking for you. And Jesus speaks too. Who are my mother and my brothers? Here are my mothers and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother. But women characters in this scene do not have their own voices. Jairus' daughter belongs to this type too. In this story, Jairus speaks, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may well and live." And some people came from Jairus' house, have their voices. "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" And Jesus speaks, "Do not fear, only believe. Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And Talitha kum. While male character speaks, the daughter who is raised by Jesus got up and began to walk about without any voice. The second type of woman is the one who is represented by male characters or the narrator in Mark. They do not only have their own voices like the first type of woman, but also do not have any chance to explain their actions. Their voices are muted by the attempts at representation. In Mark chapter 12, Jesus observed people putting money into the treasury. And he says, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on." Traditionally, this woman has been epitomized as a model for generosity or self-giving. On the other hand, some critics have tried to show she's a victim of unjust religious authority who forces even the poor widow to put money into the treasury, because in previous verses, Jesus denounces the scribes who devour widows' houses. Both approaches portray the woman based on what Jesus speaks. The reading of the woman as a model focuses on Jesus' praise. The reading of the woman as a victim comes from Jesus' critique of religious authority. But in terms of speech, she doesn't have her own voices. The narrator describes the action of the widow, and Jesus explains the meaning of her action. She acts, but she does not have any chance to explain her action. Her action is represented by Jesus. By speaking for the woman, Jesus, just like a representative, represents as if he can reach her consciousness. Here, the position of Jesus seems to be hidden, but actually Jesus represents the woman in order to teach his disciples. As you can see in the underlined part, he called his disciples and said to them. Here, the woman's voice is foreclosed. Another example of this type is the woman who anoints Jesus in Mark chapter 14. In this story, Jesus praises her anointing, saying, "Truly I tell you, wherever the good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she had done will be told in remembrance of her. Her anointing is considered as a prophetic action to establish Jesus' kingship by some critics. In terms of speech, however, she does not have her own voice. Surrounding her action are two discourses. One is the discourse of the people sitting around Jesus, which is expressed, why was the ointment wasted in this way? In other words, they represent her action to be a wasting money. Against this discourse, Jesus says, she has anointed my body beforehand for its burial. Jesus also represents her action to be a preparation of his funeral. Then, where is her voice about her action? This text does not allow her to explain her own action. Between the two discourses, her voice is silenced, as is that of the women of Sati. Not every woman is silenced in Mark. Some women have their own voices, but the investigation of their speech will discover its limitation. The first woman who has her own voice in Mark is the hemorrhaging woman in Mark chapter 5. She says, if I but touch his clothes, I'll be made well. I'll point out two limitations concerning her speech. First, it should be noted how her stories are conveyed to the reader. Her stories of all sorts of difficulties that we know are delivered to the reader not by her own voice, but the narrator. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had. And she was no better, but rather grew worse. All by narrators. Later, even when she tells Jesus her story, the narrator simply says that the woman told him the whole truth. In other words, her stories are represented by the narrator. Moreover, you can see some male characters speak clearly and publicly. Jesus is saying, "Who touched my clothes? Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." And disciples are saying too, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" But the hemorrhaging woman is speaking in her mind. Her speech is not an external expression towards others. It happens only in her mind. The Syrophoenician woman in Mark chapter 7 has a conversation with Jesus. Jesus says, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." She responds, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." She clearly speaks to Jesus. But her talk with Jesus happens only in a house privately. In the same story, Matthew changes the location of the conversation. Matthew says, a Canaanite woman from the region came out and started shouting, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon." This conversation in Matthew is proceeding in the outside. Furthermore, she cries out publicly. The typical calling for healing, "Have mercy on me, Son of David," is never given to women in Mark. As we've seen before, Simon's mother-in-law, Jairus' daughter, and the Syrophoenician woman's daughter are healed in a house. The hemorrhaging woman who is healed outside never shouts to call Jesus. She just approaches Jesus surreptitiously, without any voice. Moreover, whereas the Syrophoenician woman in Mark says once, in the same story, Matthew gives her voices 3 times, as you can see. Having mercy on me, and Lord, help me, and yes, Lord, like that. The servant girl of the high priest also have voices in Mark chapter 14. She suspects Peter of being involved with the arrested Jesus 2 times. But her testimony is dismissed by Peter and does not have a successful result. In stark contrast to these women, Herodias and her daughter in Mark chapter 6, who are high-class people, speak with their own voices publicly and even gain what they desire. When King Herod says, "Ask me for whatever you ask me, I'll give you even half of my kingdom." Following her mother's will, the daughter responds, "I wish you to give me at once the head of John the Baptizer on a platter." Finally, they gain John's head. It shows that their speech can be heard in the dominant discourses. 3 women, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome, appears in Mark chapter 15, 40 to 41, the scene of Jesus' death at first. The narrator mentions that they used to follow him and provided for him when he was in Galilee. And they saw where the Jesus' body was laid. In Mark chapter 16, verse 3, they speak, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" As the same with the hemorrhaging woman, their speech is not heard to other people, because 16:3 says they had been saying to one another. Moreover, the position of the women concerning the news about the risen Jesus should be considered. A young man commands the women to deliver a message to the disciples and Peter. "Go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." The news of the risen Jesus is given to the male disciples by the young male figure. It seems that the women play the role to just deliver the message. The premise of meeting in Galilee also confirms that there is no room for the women in this message, in that it was given to only the male disciples in Mark 14:28, as you can see. It seems to signify the women's status that is foreclosed in Mark. This analysis of the Markan speech reveals the Markan women's portrait, that is, the Markan women cannot speak publicly. Some women appear in a narrative but disappear without their own voices. Some other women are represented by others as well as silent. Even when some women speak, their voices are not heard to people publicly, except the women who are in powerful position or are connected to power. A feminist scholar, Mary Colt, interprets the women's silence at the tomb with social context of the day. According to her, the women were expected to be silent in public generally. So she concludes that the women's silence at the tomb is, quote, "the typical reluctance of women to speak in public arena," end quote. She says, quote, quite simply, the women do not speak out because they are afraid of speaking out. And the reason for their fear of speaking is that in the world in which they live, men are thought of as speakers in the public sphere. Women, whose domain is deemed to be the interior, whose position is deemed to be inferior, should be absent from and silent in the public arena. As she argues, I think that the socio-cultural repression of the women's speech of that time is reflected in this gospel. In addition to this, however, the narrative itself blocks the women's voices. Even when a woman speaks as the hemorrhaging woman does, her voice is simply delivered by the narrator. For this reason, I argue that the women's silence is not their subjective decision, but their lost voices. A statistical analysis of direct speech in Mark clearly shows the situation where the Markan women are posted. The voices of male characters strongly dominate the Markan speech in frequency and length of speech. Utterances of male characters happen around 240 times. That is 97% of all speeches in Mark. Women's voices appear only 8 times. That is 3% in Mark. When it comes to the length of speech, the gap between male and female widens. I will show one example. The total words that are used in the 8 times that women speak in Mark amount to 61 words in Greek. As you can see, hemorrhaging woman 7 words, like that. So totally 61 words, including articles. However, even a single speech by Jesus in Mark chapter 3, 23 to 29 amounts to 108 words in Greek. Even the 8 times that women speak happen in a very limited situations as examined above. If we exclude the high-class women's voices, the Markan women's voices amount to only 5 times. That is 2%. And if we exclude the voices that happen in one's mind while only among women themselves, thereby not being heard by people publicly, the voices of the Markan women appears only 3 times. That is 1%. If we imagine the Gospel of Mark as a play, the portrait of the women in Mark in terms of their speech is clearly revealed. All performers, female or male, receive their script for the play. Throughout the play, some actresses appears and perform something on stage, but they never talk on the stage. They just perform like pantomimists. And the male characters and the narrator of the play explain the women's actions. Almost all speech in Mark is done by male characters and the narrator because the playwright didn't give the line for the actresses. Then, can the women at the tomb speak? Spivak discusses the epistemic violence of imperialism, which legitimized the narrative of history as imperialism as the best and valid and natural version of history. She wonders whether the subaltern's voice can be heard in a society where epistemic violence of imperialist law and education exists. The discussion of the speech of the Markan characters discovers an epistemic violence of patriarchy in the Gospel of Mark. That is, only male can speak publicly. Public speaking is not given to the women as the subaltern in Mark. By this point, I do not intend to dismiss all positive portraits of the Markan women, which many feminist biblical scholars have tried to recover. But I point out that an interpreter needs to consider the narrative structure in which the Markan women are posted. Without this consideration, one may bring the women into a deeper silence by romanticizing the silence as a voluntary decision. For this reason, I do not agree with the argument that the women are speaking with silence, as some critics do. I agree with many Markan scholars who see this ending is open to the reader. They argue that the Markan ending can be completed by the participation of the reader beyond the text. As a possible reading of this open ending, I would like to cite the words that I rejected above again. The women are speaking with silence. By this, I do not mean that the women speak with silence subjectively and voluntarily. By that words, I suggest a symptomatic reading of the silence. In other words, through the silenced voices that is forced by the Markan narrative as a whole, we, as the leader, should see the epistemic violence in Mark and listen to the message that the women's silence delivers to us. This silent cry of the women leads us to think about our community, society, and world where some people's voices are still not heard. And the silent cry urges us to engage, to change the injustice. Yeah, thank you. Just a minute. Can I say something? Before I get some question, I would like to ask you guys a favor. Every time, whenever I have this kind of section, Q&A time, I ask people like this, because of my very poor listening. Sometimes I cannot understand the point. So please, when you have a question, please say it clearly and slowly so that I can understand and answer. If not, I'm sure that you will see me fleeing from this place without any voices. So please keep in mind this, and then please ask me questions.
Thank you. My speed of my regular speech is very fast. That's my problem. But I will be very slow now.
That's good.
I think it makes rest of us get some stress because I am very intentional. It is very related to my feedback. So it's not question, but
then you can say later faster.
Yeah, some opinion, and I need your answer anyway.
Oh yeah.
Why representation that oppress women's voice? Women's voice. So the representation. So how dare some people dare to represent some others, and that makes problems. Why does it happen? One of the reasons I thought here is, let's see, if I want to try to speak something, but you know that, it feels very hard to express that, but I think I know what he tried to tell. I can help you. I will ask you instead of you. That kind of thing happens. Maybe happen. So because we don't have enough time to do this, so people have some. It's tend to rush to some seizable result. So that's why representation happened in my thought. So to give, I think I know your point, and it is very. I think it is very welcomed in the way of progress our way. So tell me your argument, and clarify your point, that kind of thing. But people, I think the silence of women maybe just, it's not, so it depends on everybody's situation. For some, they are very fast to talk something. For some others, it just takes more days and more process to be ready. So maybe women was silenced at the very moment, but they might need some more days, some more years. But the culture to rush it to the result didn't allow that. So they just fill in their narration. So it's the very effective way. So when I saw the same text appears in Matthew. So in Matthew, there are some more women's voices. So Mark is, as I know, Mark is the very first gospel, right? And so the author of Mark might feel that, oh, I have to write something in order to use my church for some practical reason. So for some, that practical reason makes the author hurry on his writing, and that means very much of representation and just narrative, just talking by narration. But after the thing, many subsidizing document, when it was written, they might think, oh, this voice can be added. So my maybe personal grumbling, or it's the culture of maybe I am anti-academia. So the academia, the character of academia is, okay, so what is your argument? Okay, so please simplify and please clarify what you really want to say. But some people just it's not easy for some people. Not because they don't have voice, but because they don't feel comfortable about that. So yeah, that is so why representation happens. It's about, you did not deal with the subject, why representation. So you said that representation is very, it brings some bad side effect, not side effect, maybe the essential the bad effect, but I'm talking about that why representation happens. So yeah, and could you give me some feedback for, am I right?
I think your question is two, and one is about representation, and yet that kind of things happen. We are very busy, and too much people are living here. So, like some representative, American president, we need some people to deliver our voice. But think about, even we select President Trump. Not we. Actually, I didn't have any right here. So I'm invisible. But anyway, but yeah, we have a representative. But here's the problem: is that the Trump cannot reach our kind of the consciousness, where many people thinking is different. So what Spivak is talking is not, we should not represent any wrong or something like that. No, that's not. Because some people who cannot access to kind of the dominant discourse at all, because they are so poor and don't have any things to access to the dominant kind of the discourse, they should be represented actually. But in the case, the intellectuals always should be careful, because many intellectuals, obviously the Western imperialists, they just represent what they want. But in Spivak's thinking, even radical thinkers or intellectuals, when they try to support them with really, truly mind, when they try to do so, when they try to speak for them because they don't have kind of the voice, in that case, they hide themselves as if they just showing them to other people. But actually, that is not the case, Spivak says. So in that case, you intellectuals should clearly say where you are standing. So that is not you, actually your representation, or your representation is not exactly the same what they actually want to say. So, but I think Spivak later, she, we should start from this kind of understanding of we cannot represent any single subalterns. From this kind of understanding, we should start. I think I understand in that way. And secondly, you ask about the silence of the woman, right? They may, yeah. Actually, you can interpret, anyway. No. In any kind of thinking, we can interpret, text from any perspective, any thinking. But I don't know whether in Gospel of Mark, if that is the case, maybe the writer don't have enough time, so he wanna just quickly, write. But why the writer Gospel of Mark did many voices to only male? That is not explained by that perspectives. I think so. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I have two questions. The first question is, how do other gospels deal with voices of women? Comparing Mark, is there any differences between other gospels? I'm just wondering why. If other gospels also deal with the voices of women very similar to Mark, and then it makes sense. And the other question is, does your personal experience or context as an Asian, Korean, and international student impact your biblical interpretation?
And for the first question that you asked, that is my next project. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your question. And a feminist scholars try to analyze the women's speech in Synoptic Gospels, but every gospel has same problem actually, but Luke has more women's voices, and but almost all the kind of ladies like similar. But the reason why I focus on this gospel is that because the last scene, only Gospel of Mark has woman silence. The Gospel of Mark ends with woman silence. So that's why I focus on this gospel. And thank you to you. I will study more about other gospels. And yeah, definitely that is from my living context, because living here in the United States, I feel like many times I'm invisible in the society, even sometimes in school too. So that is very related to my studying, and this is kind of one part of my dissertation, and other parts is strongly related to my experience in the United States.
Well, first, let me thank you for a fine paper. I thought you did a wonderful job, so thank you for that. So the question I have is coming from me as a theologian. And what that is that from what I heard you say, you didn't say this. This is what I heard. So, I mean, if I heard it incorrectly, then forgive me. But what it seems that you were inviting us to look at is the question of, and I mean, some theologians, not biblical scholars, but some theologians have read the points that you were making for their benefit. And alternatively, though, I think that what I hear you raising the question is that even if that is the case, they're still being turned into objects, right? But they're not subjects who are standing before the divine with a full range of agential sort of possibility, but rather they're reduced to the object, so that even though the divine activity is working toward them in ways that doesn't happen that often in the Old Testament, the point of the matter is they're still not subjects. And as a consequence, what that ends up happening is that objectification contributes to the general objectification of women. So I just wanted to see if that sort of theological appropriation of your points as you were raising them makes sense, or did I hear you wrong? So I just want to ask you that.
Thank you. Actually, maybe I need to close and then just what I'm gonna answer what I understand. I'm not sure that is what exactly you asked me, but kind of the objectification and subjectivity of women about that. I think there's two ways to see this kind of gospels. One is I also thought about, because do I kind of victimize woman by these interpretations? But I think the interpreter, reader can approach the Bible adopting what Bible says. That is one, and the other one is we can see some kind of violent things, and then we can read from that this kind of the expression, or this kind of the passage is literally kind of the violent things. I'm not sure whether this makes sense, but so, for example, my reading of the women, it seems like I erase all kind of subjectivity of the woman, but reading like this, I mean, the woman's silence is kind of the exposing that times kind of the violent epistemology, or kind of the ideology, something like that. So I kind of select in that way, and for that I show kind of how woman is described in this text. So I don't know whether.
We have time for just one more question.
Okay, the cameraman gets to ask a question. There is an interpretation which says that silence is protest, or silence is speaking. When people are silent, they're saying something by their silence. And I've seen so many cultures that speak by silence. In your research, have you considered this angle?
Yeah, as I told in my paper in some parts, I read an article about this silence of women by a Korean feminist critics. She want to see this silence from the Taoist or Buddhist perspective, and some other critics also see in that way. They have a meditation, or in front of divinity or something like that. But yeah, that's possible. I think that kind of interpretation is possible within this text. I think when we consider only this text, I think that's possible. But
terms of speech, as I did, I think that makes maybe the silence kind of the romanticize the silence. I think that is a problem. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I think that's the problem.
Well, thank you very much.